So, with all your experience you are having since 2003, what can you tell us about the evolution of the internet governance ecosystem?
Well, it's first of all, we have to recognize ICANN, for instance, was in 2003 a very, very young organization. It's still young. It's not an adult in human terms. It was set up in 98, so it's 17-year-old, which is very, very young as an organization. And all the internet institutions are fairly young, and we have to go back a bit and recognize the fact that they grew organically. They followed the internet as a technology, as a distributed technology, and the governance system is equally distributed, and it was driven essentially by the technologists. In the 90s, business jumped on as they recognized the economic value of the internet, and governments were relatively late in recognizing the importance of the internet. So the challenge really was how to bring in governments into this ecosystem. And I think since 2003 we have made great progress, but clearly it's a system that is in continuous evolution. But when you look back in 2003, there was a basic mistrust of many governments to these internet institutions. Governments are not used that the global resource is administered outside their sphere of influence, so they were intrinsically uncomfortable with this. And since 2003, through the IGF, through the Working Group on Internet Governance, we have, I think, developed a much better understanding. Governments understand the technology much better. I do remember in the early days of the discussions, there was a delegate who was talking about the DNA when she meant the DNS. So that doesn't happen anymore. People are much more aware of the technology, how the technology works, and also that was part of the WSIS agreement that the day-to-day management should be left to the technical institutions. But clearly, governments need to be involved. And just looking at ICANN, the Government Advisory Council is, in those days there were maybe 30, 50 governments, now there are well over 100, and the participation is much bigger, much more sustained of governments. They take an interest, they take on responsibility. Now, clearly, the balance of who does what is still, that is something that is very fluid, and I'm sure we have not seen the final version of how it is, but greatly, I think the IGF contributed to building trust among the institutions. What was new with the IGF, that people met who would not normally meet, and they met in a setting that was fairly neutral, held under the auspices of the United Nations, that gave comfort to some governments, especially developing countries who always look to the UN as a natural home for global discussions. But at the same time, it did not follow strict UN rules of procedures, where the governments are the main speakers and the other stakeholders may speak maybe after governments have spoken, whereas the IGF more or less adopted the procedures of the internet community where everybody participates on an equal footing. That gave comfort to the technical community, to the business community, and to civil society. And governments played the game. They recognized that the other stakeholders are valuable partners. They have much to offer. The technical expertise clearly is not with the governments, it's with the technical community. Civil society plays an important role as a watchdog. Human rights, for instance, is one of the issues civil society feels very strongly about and reminds governments of their responsibilities. And of course, the business community, their business is doing business, and they want to make sure that governments don't interfere too much with their business and don't impede on the technical evolution and potential of the internet. And by having this dialogue, I think we have come much closer to see how rules can be developed. But I do remember in the early days, Windsurf was one of the preachers, one of the co-founders of the internet, usually referred to as one of the fathers of the internet. He always kept reminding us the Hippocrates principle, first do no harm. Before you decide anything, just make sure it doesn't harm the internet. And I think this rule remains as valid as ever.
In the Tunis agenda, in the final document of the WGIG process, there is a reference that is much discussed about the respective roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders. And then there is also this a formula of enhanced cooperation that should be sought. In the beginning, internet governance was lots about technical issues. But nowadays, we see all the social, political, economic, cultural implications of the internet. We see again in the new draft of the WGIG Plus 10 report that again the same expression, respective roles and responsibilities are there.
Yes, it came actually out of the Working Group on Internet Governance report. I mean, there were some, especially civil society participants, don't like it. They feel everybody has the same role. But let's be frank, in the same way, we don't want governments to interfere with the Internet Engineering Task Force in developing Internet standards. We have to respect the role and responsibility of governments, and the roles are different. Civil society has an important role, but I see it more as a watchdog. I can ring the alarm bell, so sorry, no, this is maybe not a good idea. And again, there are issues such as government surveillance, where you don't want to leave that to governments alone. Yes, governments have a responsibility for the security of their nations and citizens, but I think I'm much happier if civil society is actually involved in these discussions, that we know what happens and that we have a certain transparency on the rules that the governments apply. And the same way, as I said, the internet engineers, they want to do their business in developing standards, and they don't want others to be. Yes, they can be involved in saying maybe it would be interesting to have something more on encryption to protect privacy, but then the actual standards, they are developed by the engineer. So I'm personally fairly comfortable with this wording we have in the Tunis agenda. In the Net Mundial, we pushed it a bit and said it should be interpreted in a flexible manner, which is also something I'm very comfortable with. It's not hard and fast, these roles. It doesn't mean, and we see that also increasingly, that looking as an example at the Internet Engineering Task Force, you have much more interest also by governments who want to know how it works, and they're usually very impressed when they go to meetings. We also have much more civil society involvement in the Internet Engineering Task Force, especially on standards relating to privacy, to encryption, to human rights, and that's fine. There is I think, a cross-fertilization in multi-stakeholder involvement, but again, the roles are slightly different and they are defined. As you have in national governments, you have a separation of power between the executive power, between the judiciary and between the legislative power, and let's not confuse the different roles.
In fact, as you mentioned before, internet governance is a distributed system. So we have very different entities, processes for dealing with different issues. So in fact, when we talk about multi-stakeholder governance model, this has a different meaning in each of these different processes. So that's
correct, yes. And it's, again, the beauty of it, it follows the technology. It's bottom-up, it grew organically, adapted to the technology of the internet. And each of these institutions have developed their own procedures and processes. Common to them is that they're all very open and very inclusive, and that everybody who wants to participate and to be involved can be involved. Of course, there are barriers to entry. I mean, there is travel involved, there are language issues, there are also cultural issues. The culture is very much comes from the Anglo-Saxon model and we have to recognize that maybe people from different cultures are less comfortable with a very sometimes aggressive model of dialogue, which doesn't mean the people are enemies, but people may shout at each other, but then after the session they go and have a drink together and discuss again. But there are different cultures, and this is something which is sometimes underestimated, especially by maybe Americans who don't realize that this may be a barrier of entry. It's not just the language, it's also the culture.
Yeah. So you already mentioned the IGF. It's arriving at its 10th edition, ending a cycle that was determined by the United Nations. What kind of challenges you see ahead? So we are all hoping that the mandate will be extended well beyond maybe 10 years. What do you see as new challenges facing IGF and new role maybe for IGF?
It has always been a little bit of a balancing act between those who saw the IGF as the solution to problems, as a more kind of decision-making body, and those who saw it more as a forum for dialogue, which it was set up with. The mandate allows space for making recommendations, but it says also as appropriate, which is always a UN clause for, well, it allows for saying no, it's saying it's not appropriate. And to begin with, it was clear that the internet community, the business community, was very nervous that it would go down the road of a decision-making body where people will push for recommendations, whereas especially civil society, but also some developing countries, wanted the IGF to be more or less like a new organization with working groups and so on. So the path chosen was a very cautious one, I think, and that was the right way to do it. To first build confidence, make people feel comfortable. And I think we achieved that with the first mandate. People went to meetings, they felt comfortable discussing delicate issues, and they also had this comfort because they knew there were no decisions at the end of the discussions. So they could go into a meeting and did not have to fear unintended consequences, that then anything they may have said might be held against them at the end of the meeting and may turn into some kind of recommendation they might regret. And then with the second mandate, especially I think Bali was very much a watershed moment. It was the first IGF after the Snowden disclosures on mass surveillance, and we had a very open discussion there, and I think it was also significant that the US government decided to use the IGF meeting in Bali in 2013 as the platform how to address these issues and how to defend their actions, and also how to look a way of going forward in maybe a more transparent manner. But it clearly showed that there was a need for this space of dialogue. And at the same time, I think there was also a general feeling emerging that maybe time had come to take it a step further. When I was then with ISOC, we proposed reviving the best practice forums. We had tried to have those in the second meeting in Rio, but they never really took off. And it was also, well, part of it was there was lack of Secretariat support. The Secretariat is always very, very on a shoestring with very limited human resources. And also, especially governments took the best practice forum more as a beauty contest And we said the purpose of it is not just say you are the best, but show us what are your experience, what went wrong, what would we do different with hindsight, what are the lessons learned, what can we learn from you. So we revived those, and we had first set last year in Istanbul. Now we have the second set here in Rio. We also took the dynamic coalitions, which was the answer when some wanted to create working groups. It was decided very early on, well, let them get together if they want, and it was called dynamic coalitions. And it worked actually quite well, but downside was there were no common rules and procedures, so they all developed their different rules, and now we're trying to integrate it much more into the mainstream. But that is quite delicate, and we see there is now resistance of those who see that the first step down the slippery path of moving towards a decision-making body. So there is need for a balance, but I think the IGF is now robust enough to develop procedures, and there can also be, I think, a cross-fertilization with Net Mondial. I think Net Mondial would not have been possible without the IGF. It managed to build on what the IGF has created, this climate of trust. 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable what Net Mondial did, that governments queued up behind the microphone, and at one point we told them, you now have 30 seconds instead of 2 minutes, and they played the game. That is remarkable in itself, and I think that would not have been possible without the IGF. But at the same time, Net Mondial showed the IGF also the way forward, that it's possible to find a consensus-based output without classical negotiations, and that is where we are. It's a question of balance. And
do you think that Net Mondial can be really a role, can have this position as showing an example how can the community come together and develop real recommendations, documents, even if they are not binding for the stakeholders?
I think it was a remarkable experience, and the outcome was by far better than I had anticipated. So kudos to the organizers. And I think this sort of iterative process, which has also been used now for the document connecting the next billion, which is a similar process. And I think by developing also a body of papers like the outcome of the best practices, it's a library, it's not binding. Yeah. People can go and read up. And last year I was involved in the final editing of the best practice forum outputs. And then I was on a panel at the WSIS Fórum, and I learned that Serbia had used one of the outputs on CSIRTs and had used it as a blueprint for setting up their own national CSIRT. So that is, I think, a fantastic outcome, which is not top-down, but it is somebody used the output and for their own benefit. So that, I think, is definitely a way forward.
What do you think about the multi-stakeholder model at national level? Brazil has a leading role there, but we see one or other country trying to move the same path.
I mean, it is absolutely essential. And I visited quite a few national and regional IGFs. I do remember once in West Africa, and there was a representative of the internet community said, hey, this is actually the first time the ministry is talking to us, because they created something, and because it was sort of held in connection with a UN meeting, the minister took it seriously and actually talked to the community. And in the country where I come from, in Switzerland, that is the norm. Laws get developed through public consultation. It's also the Swiss system forces the government to do so, because if people don't like it, they collect signatures, and then there is a vote. So that is built in the system. But in many countries, that is not the norm. And Kenya is another example where they actually introduced in the constitution a clause which makes it mandatory for the government to consult stakeholders before they pass legislation. So, and I do remember, well, he's not anymore, but he was first secretary of it is the highest civil servant of the National ICT Ministry in Kenya. And I learned from Kenyan friends that he was actually engaged in list discussions with civil society. And we had lunch and I told him I learned that and I'm very impressed. And he said, yeah, it can be painful at times, but it helps us make the better decisions. And I think that's the essence of a multi-stakeholder model, that you involve stakeholders. It's not an end in itself, but the end is to find a solution that is in the interest of everybody. In that sense, it is very much participatory democracy, which involves the citizens in the decision-making process. And it shows also the results. People or countries that have some kind of mechanism in place that involves consultation with all stakeholders usually also have the better policy in place. They have better internet access, they have a broader reach of the internet, have cheaper rates because the policy they have in place is right. It's not just technology is of course important, but you need to have the right regulatory environment. And the right regulatory environment should not be developed by just a few companies that may have the power and may make profits, but that should be in the interest of the entire population. And I think there are plenty of examples that shows the countries where they have a mechanism in place for consultation with all stakeholders, they end up with a better, higher quality of the internet.
So you currently hold a seat at the ICANN Board of Directors. How are you seeing all the IANA transition process?
Well, it has been a remarkable exercise and in a true multi-stakeholder process, which at the beginning looked, well, to some, well, what's the problem? It should be very easy just to replace the government of the US goes away and we replace that with the community, but the devil is always in the detail. And the process was, as I said, remarkable, and see the incredible number of people who participated in calls, in physical meetings, in virtual meetings, and list discussions. And as an iterative process, we're not there yet, but I'm fairly optimistic that we will get there. And of course, this brings us back to the beginning. Internet governance 12 years ago was a controversial issue because of the predominant role of one government, that is the United States. And there were many then, and the WGIG report had various models how that should develop. And one of the 4 models that in the report was exactly what we are discussing now. That is, no government should have a predominant role, but it should be taken over by the community. And that was already in the report 10 years ago. And we are there now. So I think that will also greatly, I think, enhance the feeling shall we say, of legitimacy of the governance model, that this, what was seen as a transitional role when ICANN was set up, that the US government had some residual authority, but it was obvious that there was not a constitutional basis for the way going forward. And so that, I think, will greatly enhance the legitimacy of the mechanisms.